All right, let's wind the clock back to the world between 1200 and 1450. This is the period right before, well, before everything changed. And in this explainer, we're going to bust a major myth you've probably heard about this era. Yeah, you've heard this one, right? The idea that while Europe was, let's just say, on the struggle bus, the rest of the world was kind of just waiting. Well, that is completely, totally wrong. While Europe was decentralized, the rest of the world was absolutely booming with massive empires, unbelievable technology, and trade routes stretching across continent.
So that brings us to the big question for our explainer today. How did all these different leaders actually build their states? How did they get power? How did they keep it? And how did they use big ideas like religion to bring everyone together?
And our first stop has to be East Asia, specifically China. Because, look, if this period of history was a movie, China was the main character, no question about it. We're talking about the Song dynasty. By pretty much any measure you can think of, wealth, technology, unity, they were the most advanced civilization on the entire planet at this time. So the big question is, how on earth did they do it? Well, their secret sauce was a super powerful and efficient bureaucracy. This wasn't a government where nobles just inherited their jobs. Nope. This was a government of scholars. To get a top job, you had to pass this ridiculously hard test called the civil service exam, all based on Confucian philosophy. This created a true meritocracy, a government run by smart, capable people. It's a huge contrast to what we're going to see later in Europe. And they weren't just politically smart, they were an economic juggernaut. They brought in champa rice from Vietnam, which led to a massive population boom. They had the Grand Canal, basically an ancient superhighway for trade. Oh, and they also invented gunpowder and were mass-producing steel. China was literally the engine of the world economy.
Okay, now let's head west into what was known as Dar al-Islam, or the House of Islam. This region tells a completely different story. Politically, it was a bit messy, but culturally and scientifically, it was a powerhouse, all tied together by shared knowledge and faith.
And this side really shows you the big contrast. On the one hand, politically, the old Abbasid Caliphate, this once mighty empire, was breaking apart. New Turkic empires were rising up. But at the exact same time, culturally, it was a golden age. While Europe was kind of forgetting its own past, scholars in places like Baghdad's House of Wisdom were saving all that ancient knowledge and then building on it. I mean, they were the ultimate bridge of knowledge. They saved Greek philosophy from being lost forever. They took the concept of zero from India, learned how to make paper from China, and then they innovated. A guy named Nasir al-Din al-Tusi basically invented trigonometry, and their medical knowledge was centuries ahead of anyone else. So how did the faith of Islam itself spread so far and so fast? Well, a huge part of the answer is Sufism. You can think of the Sufis as the spiritual influencers of their time. They were mystics who focused on having a direct, personal connection to God, and their missionary approach was incredibly effective at winning new converts all across the map. Okay, let's keep moving east over to South and Southeast Asia. This whole area was this vibrant crossroads, a total melting pot where trade, religion, and culture were constantly mixing together to create some really unique and powerful new states. In India, you had this really fascinating situation. The north was mostly run by the Muslim Delhi Sultanate, but down in the south, you had the powerful Hindu Vijayanaga Empire holding strong. But it wasn't always a sharp divide. You had things like the Bhakti movement, a popular type of Hinduism focused on personal devotion to a single god. It actually had a lot in common with Sufism, which helped build a kind of cultural bridge between the two faiths. And this map really says it all for Southeast Asia. Over here, it was simple. If you control the water, you control the cash. Powerful maritime empires like Majapahit and Srivijaya got incredibly rich just by controlling and taxing all the ships that passed through key sea lanes, like the Strait of Malacca. Okay, time for a big jump. Let's go all the way across the ocean to the Americas. Now, this is so important to remember. While all this stuff was happening in Afro-Eurasia, these incredible empires were rising over here in total isolation, completely cut off from that entire network. They had their own unique ways of building states. So in modern-day Mexico, you had the Aztecs, or the Mexica, as they called themselves. They built this huge empire based on tribute. They didn't really try to integrate the people they conquered, they just ruled by force, demanding payments, tribute from everyone. And their capital city, Tenochtitlan, was an absolute marvel of engineering. Get this, it was bigger and way cleaner than London or Paris at the time. And then if we go further south, into the Andes Mountains, The Inca built this massive, sprawling empire without wheels or big animals to help them. So how did they do it? They used something called the mita system. It was basically a mandatory public service. Every citizen had to work for the state for a certain amount of time each year, which is how the Inca built thousands of miles of roads and incredible mountain farms. Let's head back across the Atlantic to Africa. Now, far from being some forgotten place, Africa was home to massive, incredibly wealthy empires built on these sophisticated trade networks that crisscrossed the entire continent and connected them to the wider world. And when we're talking about West Africa, the GOAT, the greatest of all time, was hands down the Mali Empire. We're talking about a huge, centralized state that controlled just an unbelievable amount of territory and resources. And the leader of Mali, Mansa Musa, well, many historians think he was the wealthiest person who ever lived, period. His empire's fortune came from controlling the trade of two things: gold and salt. When he made his famous pilgrimage to Mecca, his Hajj, he was so generous that he literally gave away enough gold to crash its value in Egypt for over a decade. And so, finally, we arrive in Europe. And during this period, Europe was, well, it was the late bloomer. Compared to all the centralized empires we've just seen, Europe was super decentralized, really just a patchwork of little competing kingdoms. The system that held everything together was called feudalism. Power wasn't coming from a central government. It was more like this complicated web of loyalties and promises. Kings gave land to powerful lords, and in exchange, those lords promised to provide knights and soldiers for the king. It was a system built for local survival, not for building a giant empire. And this chart breaks it down for you pretty clearly. You've got the king at the top, but, and this is key, his actual power was pretty limited. Under him were the lords and nobles, the guys who really controlled the land. They had knights to provide the muscle, and at the very bottom were the serfs and peasants doing all the work. The only thing that really unified the whole continent was the Roman Catholic Church, which you can see there at the center, often holding way more power than any king. So let's wrap this all up. Here's your cheat sheet for this whole era. Between 1200 and 1450, people were building states in all sorts of different ways. China used its brilliant bureaucracy and tech. The Islamic world was connected by innovation and faith. Africa and Southeast Asia built their power on controlling trade. And Europe, they relied on the decentralized system of feudalism. You can think of it like this. Each of these regions was weaving its own unique, complicated thread into a giant global tapestry. For the most part, they were separate, doing their own thing. But the big question that sets up everything that comes next is, what happens when all of those threads finally start to connect?